Good morning. Let us begin. Beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Begin by thanking our sponsors, our TALMUD Torah sponsors, for the month of Av, Paul and Kathy Pollack, in honor of all of their grandchildren. Daf Yomi shared in honor of the schos of refuah for Yehuda Ben Michal. Our week of learning sponsors, Binyomin Fleischman, in memory of his father, Shmuel Yudel, Ben Binyomin Yaakov, Zichron Lebracha, and Selma Woolf, with incredible hakara sato for the refuah of her granddaughter, Dr. Kari Davis. Our day of learning sponsors, Robert and Elena Emas, in honor of Akiva Weinberg's bar mitzvah. Beautiful. Mazel tov to everyone. Again, all the neshama should have an aliyah, the families in nechama, and all those who require a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. But with that, let us begin. A really beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Mem Ches 48, and we are picking up Emer Hashem on Mem Zayin Amud Beis 47b. And we are picking up 5 lines up from the bottom. Omerava, Hai Tana Savar. The Tana of our conversation holds Mizonos Da'araisa, that the obligation to go ahead and a husband to provide his wife with Mizonos is a biblical obligation, is a din Da'araisa. How do we know this? So we'll say the Torah says as follows. This time we learned in a Braisa. So remember, the Torah, when speaking about, it's actually interesting the context. The Torah is describing if a man marries a wife and then he marries a second wife, he is not permitted to diminish his obligations towards his second wife. So the way the Torah phrases this is, if he marries a second wife, she'ira ksusa va'onasa lo yigra. He may not diminish her she'er, her ksus, and her ona. So the shaila is, what do these particular things mean? So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, the Sadya She'era, Elu Mizonos. She'er refers to Mizonos, refers to the husband's obligation to materially support his wife. V'chinu Omer, V'achlu avasher, achlu she'er ami. The pasuk says over here in Micha, they have consumed the food of my nation. Ksusa, what is ksus? Kimashma'o. Both say ksus refers to clothing. So she'er, a husband is obligated to provide his wife with food. Ksus, a husband is obligated to provide his wife with clothing. Onasa, zu'ona ha'amura b'Torah. Onasa, what does that refer to? That refers to ona. That refers specifically to intimacy. And again, he says, zu'ona ha'amura b'Torah. V'chinu omer, imtana es benosai. This is actually interesting. This is the pasuk, ultimately, again, the conversation between Lavan and Yaakov. So Lavan trying to play the role of the pious father, tells Yaakov, don't take any more wives and afflict my wife. So the affliction that he was referring to is, if you marry more women, you won't be able to pay intimate attention to my daughters. So the idea over here is that ona refers to physical intimacy. So I will say, this is the first Tana that we're going to quote. 3 obligations that a husband has to his wife: she'er, ksus, and ona. She'er being clothing, she'er being food, ksus being clothing, ona referring to physical intimacy. And I will say, the frequency of that intimacy, again, the Gemara will discuss. Rabbi Elazar Omer, she'era zu ona. So I will say, Rabbi Elazar says, she'er doesn't refer to mizonos, rather she'er refers to intimacy. V'chinu omer, ish al kol she'er b'saro lo sikravu legalos erva. So this is actually very interesting. So he quotes over here the pasuk by erva, ish al kol she'er b'saro. So I will say, this is the pasuk telling you about forbidden relations. But the lashon it uses is she'er b'saro. So you see that she'er is a lashon of, well, she'er literally means like flesh, like body, but it means over here intimacy. So she'er means intimacy. So the Gemara says, ksusa kimashmo, ksus means clothing, onasa ela mizonos. Ona means mizonos. V'chinu omer, vaya'ancha, vayarivecha. Rabbi say, last week's parsha, we just had this. Vaya'ancha, vayarivecha, vayachilcha es haman. So Rabbi say, so again, you see the lashon over here of ona, vaya'ancha, even though, again, the lashon of vaya'ancha means he afflicted you, but ultimately, again, that lashon of ona is used in the context of food, and therefore Rabbi Elazar says, refers to mizonos. So also I want to point out, Rabbi Elazar is not arguing on the first Tana, in other words, in terms of the 3 core obligations. The obligations are the obligations. food, clothing, and intimacy. What Rabbi Elazar is arguing on is ultimately where those are learned out from. Top of Memches, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, quite interesting, She'ira Ksusa. Rabbi will say, again, just to point out, what's the pasuk? The pasuk we're referencing over here is Imacheres Yikachlo, She'ira Ksusa Va'onasa Lo Yigra. So the idea over here, the Torah is outlining that the obligations that a husband has towards his wife, share, ksus, and ona. This is an incredible limud here. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says as follows. He says, She'ira Kisusa. In fact, you have to read these a little bit as a juxtaposition. So what does it mean? He says, She'ira Kisusa. Read it as, meaning what? Lefum She'ira Tain Kisusa. In accordance with her flesh, or we're really going to see what this means is, in accordance with her age, provide her with her clothing. Meaning what? Shelo yitain la lo shel yalda lezakena. Don't give a young woman's clothing to an old woman. Velo shel zakena liyalda. And don't give an old woman's clothing to a young woman. So we'll say, if you look at Rashi, Rashi says over here, lefum she'era. Rashi says, zakena kashala masui. So an older woman often has difficulty wearing heavier clothing. Ve'ena yechola lisbol begadim rechavim. She's unable to go ahead and wear, literally wider, heavier clothing. V'yalda tzricha begadim rechavim. On the other hand, the young girl often wears, more elaborate clothing. Lehisnaos b'hem, to look beautiful. So it's such a beautiful drasha. So Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov says, she'era kisusa. Make sure her kesus, her clothing, is in accordance with her she'er, with her age. Furthermore, ksusa va'onasa. So ultimately, again, when it says ksusa onasa, so we'll say, so essentially, remember the pasuk says, she'era ksusa onasa. So really what's happening over here is Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov says, the entire pasuk is really focusing on clothing. That's really what it's focusing on. So it's saying, she'era ksusa, Kisusa onasa. She'era Kisusa teaches me her clothing should be in accordance with her age. Kisusa onasa, her clothing should be seasonally appropriate. So what does this mean? So the Gemara says, Lefum onasa tain kisusa. In accordance with the season, provide her with her clothing. Shelo yitain chadashim b'yemos hachama, v'lo shechakim b'yemos hagishamim. Newer clothing is thicker and heavier. Don't give her newer clothing in the summer and worn out clothing, which is lighter during the winter. We'll say, by the way, this Gemara is incredible. This as a father of 4 girls who is constantly replenishing wardrobes. I'm not talking about my wife. I don't talk about my wife, right? Wardrobes every single season, and not really ever having understood why people need seasonal clothing. So Lemaisa again now, Gemara Maseches Kesuvos Daf Memches Amud Aleph. Doing all right. So again, really quite an amazing Gemara over here. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov says that halacha Lemaisa, really the entire pasuk is referencing clothing. So she'era ksusa. I'll tell you something quite beautiful. On a bit of a hashkafic level, Rabbi Nachman discusses this idea, not commenting on this Gemara per se, but highlighting this concept. The Rebbe says something so beautiful. He says that mitzvos are referred to as clothing. Mitzvos are referred to as a beged, as a ksus. We've seen this reference, by the way, in Reb Tzaddik as well. And the Rebbe says there's an incredible musar that sometimes in life a person has to make sure that they're wearing the appropriate clothing. In other words, even in Ruchnius, there may be certain things that are appropriate for where we are holding right now, and certain things which are beyond us. The right thing in spirituality is a person has to know, the person always has to grow, but how to grow, what areas to grow in is something that often requires an incredible amount of contemplation and forethought. Because if a person tries to take on too much, or if a person tries to take on the wrong things, I'm not ready to take on certain things, it could totally derail a person's spirituality. And the Rebbe actually quotes this Gemara. He says, Rebbe, what do you see? There's a din that a husband has to provide his wife clothing. But when it comes to clothing, what's clothing all about? She'era ksusa, clothing has to be age appropriate. Not only that, ksusa onasa, the ksus has to be right for the particular season as well. If the clothing is not right for the particular person, or the clothing's not right for the particular season, it might be the most beautiful article, the most expensive brands, right? Wonderful quality clothing. But if it's not right for what I'm holding in life, and it's not right for the season, my season in life, then the clothing derails everything. If it's true in physical clothing, it's certainly true in ruchnius as well. I have to constantly be adding bigadim. I have to constantly be adding new articles of spiritual clothing. But lamaisa, I have to make sure that my trajectory of growth makes sense. And my trajectory of growth, I'm putting on the right garments for who I am, what I am, and where I'm holding in life. Incredible. Let's go weiter. So Tani Rav Yosef. Rabbi say, now, by the way, I'll point out over something interesting. Tosas highlights this. He says, Rabbi Ben Yaakov, that's fine, but you've just used the entire pasuk to teach you what? Clothing. What about mezonos? And what about intimacy? So Tosas points out, Rabbi Ben Yaakov must certainly learn those out, but he perhaps learns them out from other sources. Okay, so in other words, the beauty of this Gemara is everyone is agreeing on the three core obligations that a husband has towards his wife. The three core obligations are food, clothing, and intimacy. How you learn them out, that itself seems to be subject to machlokes. Beautiful. Tani Rav Yosef. Let's go weiter. She'era zu kiruv basar. She'era basar. Rav Yosef goes a step further. Rav Yosef agrees with the first Tana and holds that she'er, in fact, does refer to physical intimacy. But lamaisa, it refers to the fact that physical intimacy must also occur with actual physical contact. Meaning what? Shelo yinag ba minag parsiim. That ultimately a person should not conduct themselves like the Persians. Because how did the Persians conduct their intimate lives? Shememashmishin mitosin bilavushan. Ultimately, the Persians would engage in physical relations fully clothed. I mean, whatever, exposing whatever they need to expose, but lamaisa, again, fully clothed. So the Gemara says, Dam Rav Huna, ha'omer, if a man says to his wife, ifshi, eli ela ani bebigdi vihi bebigda, if a man says to his wife, I only want to engage in relations, me wearing my clothing, you wearing your clothing, yotzi v'nosin ksuva. Ultimately, such a man is obligated to divorce his wife and pay her out a full ksuva. That is not called intimacy. Part of intimacy, again, part of the husband's intimacy is a sense of physical closeness as well. So Rabbi say, I saw brought down in the Shem Shmuel, Sakar Rebbe, such a beautiful idea that this applies in our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu as well. Ha'omer a'i efshi ela ani bebigdi v'hu bebigda. I was saying, sometimes we come to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but we're unwilling to remove our bigadim. We're unwilling to remove certain layers. In other words, I do certain things and I engage in certain behaviors that by definition create a barrier between myself and Hashem. It creates a layer that's there. And I'm willing to engage, but I'm unwilling to remove those obstructions. I'm unwilling to remove those barriers. I'm unwilling to remove those things that create the separation between me and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the Shem Shmuel says that a person comes along, he says, I want to have a relationship, but I only want to have a relationship if you wear your clothing and I'll wear my clothing. The Gemara says, that's not a relationship. That's not a relationship. You're going to come with the barriers. You're going to come with the things that go out and separate. You're unwilling to remove the things that cause obstruction. You can't forge a meaningful relationship like that. And I will say, if we think about it, the Shem Shmuel is teaching us such a profound idea that here, see, we know each of us, I really think it's each of us, has things that we do that we know create a distance between ourselves and the Ribono Shel Olam. And yet, I have this burning desire for relationship. So I live in a little bit of this contradictory state. I want to be close, but I know that I'm actively engaged in things that push me away. But I convince myself that I could have my cake and eat it too. And to a degree I can. You can always have some level of relationship. I can have a relationship with God, even if I'm doing things that keep me separate. But Lamaisi, if you want spiritual intimacy, if you want spiritual connection, if you want the spiritual devekas, spiritual marriage with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that requires the removal of the begadim. That requires the removal of the things that I know are keeping me distant. Shem Yishmor Rebbe of Sakachav. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Afilu Ani Shebi Yisrael. So we'll say now the Gemara comments on the last part of the Mishnah. So we'll say, remember again, going back to the last part of the Mishnah said, Afilu Ani Shebi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Afilu Ani Shebi Yisrael, Lo Yipchos Mishnei Chalalin Umekonenos. It's an interesting statement. So the Mishnah said, Rabbi Yehuda said, even if a man is poor, right? Even Ani Shebi Yisrael, poorest of Jews, when he's burying his wife, he must make sure to provide for at least two flutes, and a wailer, someone to wail. I will say, by the way, I'll point out, it's interesting, in America, you don't see this. In other words, people singing at a levaya, or in Eretz Yisrael, you'll often see it. It's clear, interestingly enough, from the Mishnah, that halacha l'maisa, music in some form, right, was actually part of the levaya, right? A chalil is a flute, right? So the levaya requires at least two flutes. A wailer is someone who would go ahead and lead them in crying. Just interesting. In any event, so even an ani has to provide this at his wife's levaya. To which the Gemara says, Michlal the Tanakama Savra Hanilo. So we'll say, it sounds like to me that the Tanakama holds that this is not necessary. So, Hechidami. What's the case? What's the situation? Ida Archa. So we'll say, if it's the normal course, ultimately, again, to have these things at a levaya, so why would the Tanakama disagree and say that a husband is not obligated to provide this? So my time at the Tanakama da Amarlo. V'id the lav Archa. And ultimately, again, if this is not common, my time with Rabbi Yehuda. Why would Rabbi Yehuda require it? So what's going on over here? This is fascinating. Kagon, the arche didei, the lav arche dida. So we'll say, what's the case? The case is where this is common practice in his family, but wasn't common practice in her family. In her family, Tanakama Savar, watch this, so we're going to see this primary sugya occurs in a couple of blocks now, Samechei, so we'll see it then, but we're going to reference it now, it's quite fascinating. So listen to this. Tanakama Savar, Ki Amrinan Ola Imo Ve'ina Yoredis Imo. Both say there's a concept in halacha of Ola Imo Ve'ina Yoredis Imo. A wife goes up with her husband, but doesn't go down with her husband. Meaning what? That will say, if he has a higher quality of living than she does, let's say before they get married, he comes from a wealthy family, she does not. So she adopts his quality of life. That's Ola Imo, Ve'ino Yoredes Imo. And Yoredes Imo is, if she comes from a wealthy family and he does not, he agrees to support her in accordance with the manner to which she is accustomed. That's what it means. Ola Imo, Ve'ino Yoredes Imo. They will say, by the way, we actually insert this concept into the Kesuva, where again, we write in the Kesuva that a husband is obligated to support his wife. One word, bekushta. Kushta means in comfort. What does it mean in comfort? What does that mean? What I think is comfort, because comfort means in accordance with the lifestyle that either she is accustomed to or that I am accustomed to. The higher of the two is the one that I am obligated to support my. That's what it means. Ola imo ve'ino yoredes imo. So listen to this, Rabbi. So Tanakama Savar ki amrinan ola imo ve'ino yoredes imo hani mili nechayim. So Tanakama holds the concept of ola imo ve'ino yoredes imo. That applies when? During her lifetime. During her lifetime. Aval achar misalo. But after death, it doesn't. Therefore, we'll say what? So remember again, what's the case? Rachel's married to Ruvain. Rachel dies. In Rachel's family, it was a more simple family. They never had flutes and they never had wailers. In Ruvain's family, they always had this stuff. So Tanakama holds the concept of Ola Imo ve'ine yoredes imo, that only applies when? During Rachel's lifetime, doesn't apply during her death. Rabbi Yehuda Savar, Afilu La'achar. So Rabbi Yehuda on the other hand holds no, that the concept of Ola Imo ve'ino yoredes imo applies both during life as well as during death. Incredible. Therefore, Rabbi Yehuda holds in the Mishnah, we're talking about a case where Reuven would be obligated to provide Rachel with the flutes and with the whaler, even though, again, this was not her standard of living, it was his. Incredible. Amar Rav Chisda, Amar Rav Ukva, halacha Rabbi Yehuda. So Rav Chisda is saying Rav Ukva, the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda. So I'll say, by the way, like I said, we're gonna see this sugya. There's some really fascinating examples of this. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says, Hani mili michayim, kigon hu omer lahanik esbena, vi omer shalo lahanik, the derech benos mishpachta lahanik b'neim. So we'll say, we're going to see one of the interesting cases is as follows. Let's say again, Rachel marries Reuven, and they have a child, Baruch Hashem. And now Rachel wants to hire a wet nurse. And Reuven says, no, I don't want to pay for that. Nurse the baby yourself. And she says, well, the women in your family hire wet nurses. He says, well, the women in your family don't. Right? So what's the halacha? Ole imo ve'ino yoredes imo. So again, we'll see. I'm not going to thrash it, but we'll see this sugya. Rav Ukva, halach Rabbi Yehuda. So Rav Chisda says, Rav Ukva, the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda, namely that the concept of ole imo ve'ino yoredes imo applies even when in death. In death. Vam Rav Chisda, Rav Ukva. Mishnishtate, we'll say a very interesting case here. Mishnishtate, someone's gone insane. So what's the halacha? Bezdin yardin linechasav, v'zanin umefarnesin es ishto ubanav ubnosav v'davar acher. So a very interesting case here. Someone goes insane. What's the halacha? Bezdin goes down to his property. So Bezdin goes down to his assets, and what do? They manage his estate. And what do they do when they manage his estate? They go ahead and they provide bizonos for his wife, his daughters, his sons, and they also provide davar acher, something else. Okay, what that something else is, we'll have to see. Amrali Ravina Ravashi, so Ravina said to Ravashi, Maishna mehad disanyo, why is this different than the following case? Listen to this case. Misha halach lemedinas hayam. Let's say a man went overseas. And what happens? V'ishto tova'as mizonos. And he forgot, or whatever, well, I don't know if the word is forgot. He didn't leave any money for his wife. He was busy, right? He didn't leave any money for his wife or for his children. So now, his wife shows up to Beis Din, and she's like, I need mizonos. What's the halacha? Beis Din yardel in a chasav, v'zanin umefarnesin es ishto, avalo banav ubenosav, v'lo davar acher. Beis Din will go into his estate and go ahead and provide mizonos for his wife, but not for his children, nor do they provide davar acher. Now we'll say, we're going to see, by the way, it's actually in tomorrow's sugya, we're going to discuss about a father's obligation to support his children. We're going to get into that. Now we know that a husband absolutely has an obligation to support his wife. We just learned that, right? That's sher ksus and ona. However you want to interpret it, everyone agrees that there's a chiv mizonos. So therefore, again, if he left town without making arrangements, Beis Din will go down to his estate and make provisions for his wife from his owners, but not for his kids and not for davar acher. So they will say, so remember again, this is Ravina Travashi. Ravina that's Ravashi. I don't understand the difference between the two cases. In other words, Ravina's saying, shouldn't the halacha be the same? Case number one was, a guy went insane. What's the halacha when he goes insane, loses mental capacity? What's the halacha? Beis Din goes down to his estate and what? Provides mizonos for his wife, for his kids, and provides davar acher, something else. We don't know what something else is yet. Case number two, he travels overseas, fails to make arrangements before he leaves. What's the halacha? Beis Din goes down to his estate, provides mizonos for his wife, but not for the kids and not for davar acher. So Ravina says, what's the difference in the two cases? I don't understand why, in the case where he goes overseas, why wouldn't Beis Din do the same thing? Provide mizonos not just for the wife, but for the kids as well, and davar acher. To which Rav Ashi responds, no. Amrlei, v'lo shayni lecha ben yosei ladas, ben yosei shelo ladas. There's a huge distinction, I will say. In the case of where a person goes insane and loses capacity, he didn't have an opportunity to go ahead and provide, to make arrangements. So what do? Beis Din acts based on what we assume a normal, regular person would do. What does a normal, regular person do? He supports his wife, he supports his kids, and he provides money for davar acher, whatever davar acher is. When a guy goes overseas, I will say, He had an opportunity to make arrangements. But what? He didn't. He has full mental capacity. If he wanted to go ahead and set aside money for his wife and for his kids and for davar, he could have done so. Now, when it comes to his wife, he's biblically obligated to support her. So if he didn't take care of that, Beis Din will act on his behalf and do that. But as far as his kids are concerned, as we're going to see, a father doesn't necessarily have an obligation to support his kids. He could have made those arrangements, yet he chose not to. Beis Din, in that case, says Rav Ashi, doesn't have the ability to go ahead and just act on his behalf when he could have made arrangements. Rav Ashi is making such a fundamental distinction. When a guy loses capacity, we have to act on his behalf because he cannot make arrangements for himself. So we act based on the standards of a regular person. But when a guy could have done something, didn't do something, Beis Din doesn't have a right to go ahead and act on his behalf, except for things for which he is biblically obligated to go ahead and provide, which is mazonos for his wife. Pretty incredible. But take a look at Rashi. It's actually quite interesting. Rashi says, "Lo shayni lecha yotzi ben hamakom ledas." When a person leaves his locale and he has complete knowledge, complete capacity, he had the ability to make arrangements for the mazonos of his wife and for his kids, and yet he didn't do so. Gila daito she'ino rotze lezonan. He's obviously making it clear that what? He doesn't want to support them. Now again, hilchach ishto demechayim lebitnai ksuva ishta b'nechasei. So his wife, he doesn't have a choice. Right? His wife, he has to support. But for one's children, as we'll see, he doesn't have an obligation to support them. Now, I will say, what essentially Rav Ashi is answering to Ravina is, there is a default. The default we assume with most people is that what? They want to support their family. That's the, not indefinitely, right? But Lamaisa, right? But Lamaisa, right? A regular person wants to support their family. So therefore, nishtatis, the default kicks in. So the default is, again, I will say, wife, there's never really a question about wife because wife is not a choice. A man is obligated to support his wife. But the default is, if I have children, at least young children, I want to support them. So when the status, the default kicks in. But a guy travels overseas and could have made arrangements, but doesn't do so. You have no right to activate the default. We have to go with what is, which is we assume that Allah Alamaisi doesn't want to support his kids. Incredible. So my davar acher, by the way, what is this davar acher? Very interesting. Amar Rav Chisda zeh tachshit. Davar acher refers to, now we'll say tachshit usually means or could mean jewelry. In this case, look at Rashi, fascinating. Tachshit means besamem shel avkas rochel shanoshim miskashtos pahem. Perfume. So Allah Alamaisi means perfume. So we'll say, so again, just to be clear, so now just to plug this in, actually let's read this second. Rav Yosef Omer, tzedakah. It means charity assessments against the estate. So we'll say, remember again, in communities, there'll be a tzedakah tax that they would assess against, or tzedakah obligations that they would assess against every individual of the community. So we'll say, so just to plug this in for just a moment, it's quite fascinating. So therefore, remember, in the first case of nishtatis, where the guy goes crazy, loses capacity, insane, he goes insane. So l'maisa, again, in that case, what is the halacha? Basically goes down to his estate, provides money for his wife mizonos, kids mizonos, and davar acher. So I will say, so according to Rav Chisda, davar acher is we give the wife money for perfume. According to Rav Yosef, we also take from the estate it's community tzedakah. So I will say, in the second case of where he goes overseas, he leaves ladas. So in that case, then what? Halacha l'maisa, we don't seize money for davar acher. So either that means we don't give the wife money we'll give money for mizonos, but not for perfume. Or according to Rav Yosef, we won't seize money for tzedakah from the estate in that case. So watch this. Manda amar tachshit kol shekein tzedakah. So I'll say the opinion who says that we seize money for perfume, right? They'll take money for perfume, would certainly agree that we also take money for tzedakah. Manda amar tzedakah val tachshit yavinallah. Now we'll say this is really referring to the second case. So in the second case, for yatzala daito, right, where the husband leaves willingly. So what was the halacha there? We'll take money for the mizonos for the wife, but we don't take money ultimately for what? For mazonos for the kids and for davar acher. So the opinion who says that lamaisa davar acher is tachshit, if you're not going to take money for the wife's perfume, you're still not going to take money for tzedakah. Man damer tzedakah, but the opinion says that it's tzedakah about tachshit yavinala would still agree that although we're not seizing money for tzedakah, we will give the wife money for perfume. Why? Because the husband does not want his wife to become physically repulsive. Rabbi say, understand something. Perfume bisman hagimara is different than perfume than the way it's used today, right? Perfume today is used as an enhancement. Perfume in terms of the Gemara was often used to mask odor. And that's because, again, right, personal hygiene, daily hygiene was different. People weren't necessarily bathing every single day. So perfume was incredibly important just for a person to smell good. So therefore it's interesting. So the Gemara says, according to the opinion who says that the acher is tzedakah, if the husband leaves he goes overseas and he doesn't leave any instructions, we won't seize money from the estate to satisfy his tzedakah obligations. We'll wait till he gets back. But we would seize money to give his wife money for perfume because we assume that a husband wants his wife to be beautiful, right? Or I should say to not become repulsive. Incredible. So the Gemara goes weiter. Amar Rav Kiya bar Abin, Amar Rav Huna. Interesting case. Misha halach lemedinas hayam umeise ishto. So listen to this. If a man went overseas, and while he's overseas, his wife died. So now we have to pay for the levaya. So Beis Din Yardin l'nechasa v'kover also. So Beis Din ultimately goes into his estate and takes the money from his estate to provide for her burial. Lefi kavodo, in accordance with his honor. So Gemara says lefi kavodo v'lo lefi kavoda, in accordance with the husband's honor, not her honor. Ema af lefi kavodo, even in accordance with his honor. What do you see from here? Both say they had to be paskin. Hakamash malon ole imo ve'ino yoredes imo afilu la'achar misa. Oh, remember again, we saw before there was a machlokes. Everyone agrees that when a man marries a woman, ole imo ve'ino yoredes imo, she goes up with him in terms of a higher lifestyle, but never goes down. So she is supported in accordance with the higher of the two lifestyles, her own or his own. Wait a machlokes. What about when she dies? So I will say again, it was a machlokes in the Tana Kama and Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah. Kamashal and we paskin that even when she dies, we apply the concept of ole imo b'eni yoredes imo. So her levaya ultimately again will reflect the elevated standing of her husband, assuming that she married into a wealthier family. Interesting. Amrav Nasna. So I will say, by the way, it's also fascinating. What do you also begin to see? Again, we don't have this today because we do not have this level of organized community. But Abbasi, you see that in an organized community, the power of Beis Din. I mean, this is the power of eminent. I mean, I guess it's not really eminent domain because you're not seizing assets, for the greater good. But you see, it's Hefker, Beis Din, Hefker, right? That Beis Din has power over people's money. That here again, wife died, husband is nowhere to be found. He's overseas on a business. He's nowhere to be found, right? He can't wire any money or do anything. So Beis Din has the right to go take property, sell it off, or do whatever they have to do in order to provide for the burial needs of the wife. Incredible. Amar Rav Nasna, ha'omer imeselo tikbaru minichasav shomenlo. So we'll say this is an interesting case. Let's say a man says, if my wife dies, do not bury her from my estate. Don't use my property to bury her. Shomenlo, we listen to him. Maishna ki amar, why? The nafli nechasi kameyasmi. Because essentially, I will say what he's saying is that halacha lamaisa, the property is going to become the property of the Yisomim, and therefore, again, the wife's burial should not come from that property. Kilo amar nami nechasi kami yasmi rabu. Even if he says nothing, a man's property is always going to become one day the property of the Yisomim. But how does he have a right to say that his wife shouldn't be buried from that property? Ella, here's the case. We'll say this is fascinating. Haomer imeshu. Lo sikpurum in the chasav. Listen to this. Let's say a guy is on his deathbed. And he says, when I die, do not bury me from my estate. In other words, don't pay for my levaya from my estate. So the Gemara says, Ein shomelo. We don't listen to him. Why not? Lav kol heimenu sheyashir es banav v'yapil atma latzibor. It is not appropriate for him to enrich his son while taking from the assets of the tzibor. In other words, I will say, what's going on over here? What's the havamin over here? The havamin is like this. There's a concept of mitzvah lekayim divrei hames. There is an obligation to go ahead and uphold the words of someone who's going to die. So can you imagine the scene, right? Reuben's on his deathbed, right? And again, everybody's huddled close. He's saying his final words. What are the final words? Don't spend my money on my levaya, right? Call up Abbas Yisrael, like let them pay for my levaya. So the kid's like, the Tata's final words, right? He doesn't want us to spend his money. So beautiful, right? They come to Beis Din says, very nice. Hopefully he told you something else also, because we're not listening to that. Right? So I said the idea over here is, this in general is an incredible idea, that a person is not permitted to enrich themselves at the cost of the community. Again, one of the many examples we have about how we only use communal tzedakah funds for an individual when there are no other options. If there are other options, then halacha l'maisa, a person is obligated to avail themselves of those options before taking community money. Okay, incredible. Says the Mishnah. So we'll say, fascinating Mishnah. These are great sugyas. Li'olam hi b'reshus ha'av. A girl we're assuming right now, is always in the reshus of her father, ad shetikanes l'reshus habal l'nisuin, until ultimately, again, she enters into her husband's domain for nisuin. Now, both say, I'm sorry, go back to TALMUD Aleph just for one moment. Take a look at Rashi. That's Rashi on the daf. Li'olam hi b'reshus ha'av im ba bas Yisrael me'urasa l'kohen. He eina ocheles betruma v'zakai ba kichol zuchus ababito. So we'll say the idea over here is, what this seems to be saying is like this. Even once a girl enters into Erusin, remember during Erusin, where was a girl living? In her father's home. We'll say, I'm using the word girl because we're assuming right now, we must be talking about what? Either a ketana or a nara. Obviously, once a girl becomes a bogeres, she's now no longer a girl. She's a woman. And as a woman, she's a full-fledged adult. So the idea that the Mishnah is saying over here is like this. That a girl, right, kitana na'ara, is fully in her father's rishus until when? Until she transitions into her husband's rishus. Now, both say, if you notice, by the way, the Mishnah adds in rishus abal, linisuin. Rabbi say, this is a wild sugya. Because if you take a look at Rashi says, by the way, what's nisuin? Kilomar, shetikanes l'chuppah. L'shem nisuin, shetei mesura l'rishasabal. Rabbi say, we're going to get into this. We're not going to have time to do it today, but we'll have to do it in one of the future days. There is a fundamental machlokas as to what is the definition of chuppah. We think of chuppah as the chuppah, the canopy that a chassan and kala stand under. Again, see, it's not fair to look at what we do, because remember, we do everything under the chuppah. We do erusin under the chuppah, we do nisun under the chuppah. So, but we look at chuppah as the canopy. We're going to see that there's an interesting machlokes as to what the definition of chuppah is. For now, if you look at Rashi says over here, shte chuppah is l'shem nisuin shetei mesura l'reshus habal. Chuppah represents chuppah. Nisuin represents entry into the husband's domain. Okay, so that's the statement of the Mishnah. A girl is considered to be fully in the domain of her father, the reshus of her father, until she enters into the domain of her husband in Nisuin. Says Rashi, what's Nisuin? Chuppah. Good. Masr ha'av l'shluchei abal. So now it's just some interesting applications of this case. Masr ha'av l'shluchei abal. If the father ultimately gives his daughter over to the agents of the husband, in other words, let's say the husband sends a shaliach to go ahead and escort his wife, his arusa, to him. Hari hi b'reshus abal. So now what the Mishnah is adding in is the father giving his daughter over to the agent of the husband, essentially also represents entry into the husband's reshus. Hari b'reshus abal. Halach ha'av im shluchei abal. However, the father accompanied his daughter together with the shaliach, with the agent of the husband, or for that matter, the father dispatched messengers to accompany his daughter with the husband's messengers. Hare hi birshus ha'av. She still remains in the reshus of the father. As we'll say, what is the Mishnah saying? The only time that she leaves the reshus of the father and enters into the reshus of the husband is when the father is no longer a presence. So in other words, if the father hands her over to the shaliach of the Baal, then she's in the reshus of the Baal. But if the father accompanies the shaliach, right, or the father's shluchim follow, right, accompany the shaliach, then the father has not removed himself. If he hasn't removed himself, she is still in his rishos. Next, masu shluchav l'shluchei abal, harei rishos abal. If, let's say again, the agents, the messengers of the father, gave her over to the messengers of the husband, at this point now she's in the rishos of the Baal. Incredible. Good. Shabbos, let's analyze this. My li'olam. Shabbos, the Mishnah started off by saying, li'olam hi b'rishos ha'av ad shetikanes l'rishos habal l'nisuin. A girl is always considered to be in the rishos of her father until she is fully given over to the rishos of her husband in nisuin. What does that mean? I mean li'olam, always. What does that mean? My li'olam. Lafuki mi Mishnah Rishona. Oh, I will say, watch this. This is coming to go ahead and exclude something or refute something that we learned on Kesuvos Daf Beis Amud Aleph. What do we learn Kesuvos Daf Beis Amud Aleph? Higias ma velo nisu ochalas b'shol v'ochalas b'truma kash on the olam. Boss, remember this sugya? Of course, do you remember this sugya? Boss, the halacha is, remember, a man and woman enter into erusin. Talmudically, how long in the times of the Gemara? How long was there between Erusin and Nisuin? Often up to a year, right? I will say, so again, what's the halacha? What would happen if after a year comes, and the husband just doesn't have his act together and is not ready to get married? Remember again, what did the Gemara say? What's the halacha? There is a support obligation that is triggered. Husband is obligated to support his wife after a year. If halacha l'maisa again, he is unable to go ahead and get married because of circumstances, related to himself. Furthermore, the Gemara said not only that, but if he's a Kohen, after a year she's permitted to eat truma. So our Gemara comes along and says that our Mishnah comes along to say that is false. That is not true. In other words, maybe there's a support obligation, that could be, but l'maisa, she's not allowed to eat truma. Why is she not allowed to eat truma? Because until she is given over to her husband in Nisuin, she is in the rishos of her father. And assuming that she is a Yisraelis, therefore she is unable to eat truma while she is in the rishos of her father. Incredible. So remember again, what the father gives her over to the rishos of the Baal, to the shluchim, right, to the agents of the Baal, she's now in the rishos of the husband. Amarav, Misirasa lakol chutz mitruma. So here's what's interesting. When we say that when the father gives her over to the shaliach of the Baal, so now she is fully considered to be in the rishus of the Baal. What does fully mean? So Rav says, in every way except for truma. Meaning, she is fully considered to be in the husband's rishus, except that if the husband is a Kohen, she can't eat truma. Yet. So we'll say, what would be a good example of this? Let's say after the father hands her over to the shliach of the Baal, she makes a neder. Who has the power of revocation? Husband. I was about to say, what Rav is saying is, when the Mishnah says that when you give her over, remember again, let me go back, let me clarify. The Mishnah said that when the father hands her over to the shaliach of the Baal, what's the halacha? She's in the rishus of the Baal. The Gemara is now trying to figure out, does that mean for everything, for some things? Rav says it means for everything except truma. So in other words, she is fully considered to be in the rishus of the husband, except that if the husband is a Kohen, she can't yet eat truma. But for everything else, she's in the rishus of the husband. Rashi says, truma, the time of dida mishum simphon. Rabbi said we're going to see the reason for this is because later on we're going to discuss the idea out of a concern that perhaps he's going to discover some type of physical flaw in her that's going to cause mekachtos, that's going to void the marriage. So because of that concern, we do not let her eat truma until after nisuin. But Ravasi says after truma. Ravasi says no. When the Mishnah says that after the father hands her over to the shaliach of the husband, she is in the rishus of the Baal. That means for everything, even truma. So we'll say machlokis Rav and Ravasi. So Eisvei Rav Huna Ravasi. Rav Huna raised the kashan Ravasi. Va'amri leichia barav Ravasi li'olam hi b'rishus ha'av ad shetikanes l'chlupa. But yeah, we'll say we learned that what? What did the Mishnah say? First line of the Mishnah, she is always in the rishus of the father until she enters into chuppah. So we'll say, it appears from here that what? That ultimately, again, being given over to the shaliach of the husband does not affect full entry of rishus, does not affect full entry into the rishus of the husband if she requires chuppah. So Ravasi, how can you say that once she's given over to the shliach of the husband, she can eat truma? It's not true. So I say it's great. Amalu Rav said, I want to point out over here, Rav said to Rav Huna or Chia. Chia is Rav's son. Rav Huna is Rav's Talmud. Right? So Rav either said to his son or to his Talmud, how many times have I told you? Lo tizlu basar ibcha. Never try to refute someone from a proof that can be turned on its head. Because after all, you could answer. You could always answer. Ravasi can answer you. V'sirasa zuhi knisasa l'chuppah. Ravasi could always answer you, and he could say, the giving over of the wife, of the girl, to the shaliach of the husband is what? Is chuppah. Is like chuppah. And therefore, again, that's why Ravasi holds that she could even go ahead and eat truma. So we'll say, so that's machlokis number one. Machlokis number one, halacha l'maisa again. So we'll say, here's what we have. The Mishnah tells me that when the father hands the girl over to the shaliach of the husband, she is now in the rishus of the husband. What does that mean? So Rav says, for everything except truma consumption. Ravasi says, even for truma consumption. That's machlokis number one. Ushmuel amar liyerushasa. So it's very interesting. Shmuel says that what it means is for Yerusha purposes. For Yerusha purposes. Rabbi say that. What does this mean? Let's say father hands over the daughter to the agents of the husband, and now what? Daughter dies. Daughter dies. Who inherits her? Shmuel says her husband inherits her. I'm also going back to yesterday's daf. That would mean, again, all of her dowry, everything else, would now go to the husband. Once she's handed over once she's given over, to the agent of the husband, ultimately, again, she's in his rishos for Yerusha. Reish Lakish amar l'ksuvasa, for a ksuva. So the Gemara says, ksuvasa maihi. What does that mean, or ksuva? Does that mean the meisa yarisla, that if she dies, he inherits him? Hainu the Shmuel. Then Reish Lakish is saying the same thing as Shmuel. Amar Rabina lomar ksuvasa me'achar mana. No, this is fascinating. I both say, you know what it means? What it means is like this. Let's say halacha l'maisa. Excuse me. Let's say halacha l'maisa. Father hands over his daughter to the agents of the husband, and now what? Rabbi say, now what? Now either husband dies or they get divorced from Erisin. What's the halacha? When she remarries, her ksuva is only 100 zuz, like a second marriage. Like a second marriage. Okay. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yechanina, Dami Tarvayu, Misirasa Lakol Afla Truma. But it comes on Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yechanina, and they say no. When the Mishnah says that when the father gives his daughter over to the agents of the husband, she is in the rishus of her husband. What that means is for what? For what? For everything. For everything. Ksuva, Yerusha, Truma, everything. Everything. So it says the Gemara, Meisvei, Halacha avim shluchei baal. So I'll say this is actually a very interesting. We'll start this today, but we'll have to conclude this tomorrow. Halacha avim shluchei baal oshalchu shluchei avim shluchei baal. So let's listen to this case. Actually, you know what I'll say? We're going to stop over here. We'll pick up Emir Hashem with this Meisvei tomorrow. I know we have a lot. We'll have a lot to do tomorrow, but it's all right. Gemara flows quickly. So actually, no, it doesn't. I shouldn't say that. Right? Hey, so I'll say, so it just makes me feel better. I'll say, but again, I just want to point out what we're leaving off here is here's what we know. We have two principles. Principle number one is that a girl is considered to be in the rishus of her father up until the time that she enters into the rishus of her husband. Now, in a classic case, entering into the rishus of her husband means what? Means what? Chuppah nisuin. The Mishnah introduces us to an additional idea that once the husband hands her over to the once the father hands her over to the agents of the husband, she is now in the rishus of her husband as well. The shaila is, the machlokes is, what does that mean? Does that mean fully in the rishus of her husband, like she entered into chuppah? Or is it some quasi-entry into the rishus of her husband, but not full entry? Emir Hashem resolution tomorrow. Shkayach.